So today we're talking about what happens if Corbyn gets elected with John Rees. So John's going to speak for about 25 minutes and then we'll have lots of time for questions and discussion. So John.
Okay, well, we called the meeting because I think there is a very, very widespread but kind of under-articulated, publicly articulated debate going on in the Labour movement. And I think lots of people assume that Jeremy Corbyn is going to win the next election. That's not a sort of massive gamble, given the total and utter state of decomposition of the existing government. But it is an assumption, you know. But it's an assumption we're going to make for the purposes of this meeting. I'm talking about what the problems will be that confront an incoming left-wing government, and what the kind of scale of response would have to be for it to be successful. So I guess the first thing to say is that a lot of things that are actually being discussed as if they were products of Brexit are actually very, very long-term fundamental problems in the British economy. A low productivity, low investment economy has been a hallmark of British capitalism since at least the 70s, and arguably since the interwar period. Turning that round is going to be an absolutely enormous task in itself. It is going to require a massive state-led investment program to mobilise the kind of resources which would in any way begin to turn around a kind of couple of generations of low investment and low productivity in the British economy. Anything that an incoming left government would need to do would need a steeply progressive taxation system implemented very, very quickly. Actually, the main problem isn't, although desirable, simply taxing rich individuals. The question of corporation tax would be absolutely central here. We're in a regime in this country that's got 17% corporation tax. The European average is 22%. The American figure is 35%. You would need American levels of corporation tax to begin to address some of the problems, one of which, of course, is the reconstruction of the welfare state, by which I include housing right across the board from a generation's worth of neglect. Now, these are problems which, as we all know, are on a daily basis eating in to working people's lives in a cumulative and dramatic way. And if a left government can't address these, can't begin to provide very, very quickly solid evidence that it's beginning to turn the corner of a generation and more of neglect, there will be a political cost to pay, and it will be very, very unpleasant indeed. You know, when a society polarizes like this, when which is a product of the whole of the mass movements of the last decade and more, and then of Corbyn's ascendancy inside the Labour Party after that, when people become very, very hopeful, and I think there is a mood of hope and expectation among working people now, which is more advanced, a more kind of aggressive and confident than at any point since the defeat of the miners' strike. If you fritter that away, if you don't deliver on that, this won't be the last twist in this spiral. And I think you have to imagine not just what success would be like, but what disappointment would look like at this point. And at this point, I think, if that delivery doesn't take place, you will be looking at, rather than Britain being the exception in Europe, in not having, at the moment, a far-right populist party that's in the ascendant, it will go to having one in the ascendant, and possibly worse still. If you don't look like the look of the Football Lads Alliance now, imagine what that kind of thing would look like in that era of disappointment. So, all I'm saying is the task is very big and the stakes are very high. And that's one important thing to have very, very clearly in front of us when we're debating these things. In short, what I'm saying is that you need a 45 Labour government for the 21st century. But that's not easy to achieve. It's not often understood or often articulated, but the 45 Labour government came after Labour had been part of Churchill's wartime coalition, and not a minor part either. It had been a substantial part. Clement Attlee held 3 senior offices of state in the 40 to 45 Churchill administration. Practically all the major departments, and especially the departments to do with industry and home affairs, were either led by Labour figures or were shared between a Tory and a Labour figure. Of course, there was massive nationalisation of industry during the war, and massive welfare programmes as well. So what the 45 Labour government inherited was an economic structure and an experience of government which the Corbyn administration simply won't have. So okay, so that's before we frighten ourselves to death. That's the scale of the problem, and I don't say that to make people nervous. It's just a political reality in this country. What are the dangers? What are the difficulties in meeting that kind of challenge? Well, of course, one important thing is that there's a leader of the Labour Party who wants to meet that challenge, and that is, in this country and in the Labour Party, historically unique. Without exception, and including Clement Attlee, I don't believe there's been a Labour Party leader who more wanted to meet that challenge. But it is going to face a very, very difficulties. Let's just briefly refer, I'm going to refer to it briefly because it's the most commonly discussed. I think there is a recognition, a discussion in the left, that there would be a backlash from the political establishment and from the capitalist class in this country faced with a government that was intent on that kind of programme. Now, I know there's some kind of discussion going around that there wouldn't be this kind of backlash, that you wouldn't see the kind of things that previous Labour governments have seen. I just simply don't believe that that's very, very likely. You've got to remember that, famously, Harold Wilson, whose government was nowhere near having to meet these kind of challenges, and who was a figure who was nowhere near as left-wing as Jeremy Corbyn, had in his first administration Lord Cromer, the governor of the Bank of England, come to him early in his days of office and say, look, Labour's plans are just unworkable. There's going to be a run on the pound, you just can't do this. And Wilson, to his credit, told him to clear off. He said, I'm the Prime Minister, I've got an elected mandate, I'm going to implement Labour's manifesto. He tried to do it for 6 months, there was a run on the pound, Lord Cromer came back to him and said, I told you so, and that was it. Now that pressure, or some version of that pressure, from the corporations, from the civil service, from the military, will exist. I think the least of it is the Secret Service. I know Paul Mason was raising the question the other day in the Guardian about whether or not there had been some kind of, I must have missed it. I've got a lot of time for Paul, gave my book a very good review, and don't want to say anything rude or uncomradely, but I just don't think that there's been a magic moment where the security services and the apparatus of the state, if it's suddenly transformed at some point in the last 20 years, I just missed it. And everybody else missed it as well, Paul included. Nobody said, oh, did you see this? The Secret Service aren't going to behave like this anymore. I don't think that's very likely, and it's not how they're behaving at the moment. If you look at how they're behaving towards the Muslim community now, systematically, they will behave like that to the left and the trade unions, again, as they have done in the past under elections. So that's a significant problem, and there's no question about that. And the trouble with electoral politics is it doesn't prepare you for that. It assumes that the rules of the game are going to be abided by your opponents when they aren't. Because to meet that kind of challenge will require, even if you had a massive parliamentary majority, it doesn't deal with that. It doesn't deal with the run on the pound, it doesn't deal with the investment strike, it doesn't deal with unrest in the military or the security services. For that, another kind of politics is necessary, and I think that we have to begin to think through what that would look like. I think so. That's the kind of obvious, a very British coup kind of difficulty which Labour will face. And as I say, I think lots of people in the movement are kind of aware of that and are thinking about that, even if they don't necessarily have a solution to it. But I do think that there's also a different course of development which we have to look squarely in the face as well, and that's not the external attack, it's the kind of internal decay problem. And I just want to point out three areas which I think are going to be difficult here. Foreign policy is the first and most obvious of them. I mean, my friend and comrade Andrew Murray put this very clearly. He says, we have an anti-war leader of the Labour Party, but not an anti-war Labour Party. In fact, it's a bit more serious than that, because at the moment, and from Emily Thornberry's speech at conference, the entirety of the rest of Labour policy is aligned to the standard issue ruling class Atlanticist agenda. Pro-NATO, pro-Trident, pro-2% of defence spending, which actually most European powers don't even meet. And that, it's a problem in this sense. Actually, it's an immediate problem, because it's disarming, it's the only kind of disarming that's taking place actually, is disarming Labour at a point when that Atlanticist foreign policy is in a very, very deep crisis. You know, Trump is ripping up the Atlanticist agreement with the British from his side of it. The Bombardier investment tariff was a huge blow to that vision of what NATO should be about. As we talk, Turkey, which is a NATO country, is busy invading Syria and attacking the Kurds. The United States and Britain's main ally, Saudi Arabia, is engaged in a war in the Yemen. Now these are, and NATO member Spain is currently gearing up to dissolve the Catalan administration. Now, if you had an independent left foreign policy, you could be attacking, and very effectively, and in very popular terms, one of the mainstays of the British establishment in this country at the moment. If you adopt the same policy, you're disarmed from doing that. And I know that there's an argument that goes around the Labour movement, well, you know, this is difficult territory, let's just stay away from this and concentrate on the bread and butter issues. Now, even if that were a principled position to take, and even if you thought, okay, strategically that's a sensible thing to do, there are very real problems, because the Tories will never let you do it. You know, it's not your free choice to decide to only concentrate on what you imagine your strengths to be. The Tories are very, very clear that defence, that the linked questions of patriotism, of the war on terror, of immigration, of nationalism, are absolutely bound up with the questions of international policy and defence policy, and they will never let it go. So even if you thought it was a good idea to avoid it, they will bring this fight to your door. Now actually, it's not a weakness for Labour, and one decisive moment in the election campaign proved that. After the Manchester attack, when Jeremy, and as I understand it, against a lot of internal advice to do the contrary, decided to link it with the war on terror, that actually saved Labour's election campaign from being torpedoed by the Manchester and London attacks and the Tory response to them. So that's an issue which I think needs to be addressed. There's one other issue I think which we have to look at very, very clearly, which is the question of the EU negotiations. Now it's quite clear that, you know, whichever side of that debate you were on, the Tories are absolutely destroying themselves on this issue and are absolutely incapable of dealing with the European Union. Now, I think that what's going on here now is the European Union started off with a kind of punishment-beating approach to the negotiations. You know, the EU bureaucracy is accountable to no one, so it's a very, very hard line, very, very nasty operation. It's a bit like the security services. There's no question of transparency or democracy or accountability here. It's a bunch of bureaucrats who are absolutely out to defend their project. And from their point of view, their job was to inflict as much pain on the British as they possibly could to deter anybody else from thinking of leaving the European Union. But it's absolutely obvious in recent weeks that there's something else going on, which is that they think, and they're not wrong about this, that the government is a total shambles, that they will get a better, or at least more coherent position out of a Labour government, and they are playing a dead bat in the negotiations in the hope that they can deal pretty soon with the Corbyn administration, rather than having to deal with this bunch of cretins that are currently the government of the country. Now, you know, it's possible to, of course, it's possible to read this positively, that Jeremy Corbyn looks like the famous government in waiting, looks like a serious politician, looks like he could deal with this, and that's absolutely true. But it depends what the content of this now becomes. Because moving towards the sort of centre of European politics, which is where Keir Starmer and beyond him, Chuka Umunna and these people would really like to go, will be to begin to moderate, if not gut, a radical economic stance. So there's a moment of difficulty and possibly of internal corrosion coming from that direction as well. And perhaps this is part of what is, in any way, a sort of wider realignment of ruling class and establishment thought. Again, if you look at the IMF report, which says, yeah, nothing wrong with taxing the rich. Now that's an unusual thing, isn't it? Now why is that? Why is the IMF of all bodies suddenly decided that it likes the look of an element of Labour, and not just centrist, but left Labour policy? And I think there is now a strand of establishment thought which thinks this, that even in our terms, the neoliberal model is bust. If we don't adapt it and change it, then not only will there be the possibility of serious domestic unrest, but there will also be a serious problem with the viability of capitalism as a whole. Now, you know, where any day you open the paper, there's a kind of blinding example of this. I would say that this week's spectacular example of this is GWR's launch of its new hybrid train. I don't know whether people saw this with Chris Grayling on board. The GWR, if anybody who travels down to the West Country, as I do a bit, will know this. GWR has been destroying Isambard Kingdom Brunel's great railway systematically for the last few years in the name of electrification. Now, they ran out of money for electrification, so although Christ stops at Eberley, electrification stops at Chippenham. The line is only electrified as far as that. After that, down to Bristol, it's not electrified. So they've had to build a hybrid train, which is both running on electric and running on diesel. The train is so heavy that it degrades the rails as it runs. And when they tried to run it for the first time this week, it was 41 minutes late into Paddington, and the air conditioning had gone, so the passengers were being drenched with water coming down from the air conditioning. Now, this is no way to run a capitalist society, to be honest. Even capitalists must begin to be thinking, surely, if we just had a state-led investment program and rebuilt the damn railway properly, we'd be further forward than this. And you know, this is not, we're so used to the neoliberal model, so used to the privatisation, deregulation model, that we forget that there have been very long phases, and particular countries who've used a much more state-directed model, not least the most successful capitalist economy in the world, the Chinese one, to solve some of these problems. Now, does that matter if it delivered? Well, it does matter, because what might happen under these circumstances is that you get a kind of version of bankers' Keynesianism. Now, you know, we've tried that with quantitative easing. We tried, and to be fair to the Blair government, it did throw money at education and at health, but it threw it through the mechanism of either state and private amalgamations or through forms of privatisation and deregulation. And the whole era of disaster in the NHS and in housing is a result of that. So if the policies got ameliorated in this direction, you would begin to see a corrosion of faith, I think, in the ability of the government to meet those very, very deep problems and very, very sort of fundamental demands that are now, I think, uppermost in most working people's minds when they think about what might change with a government. So those, I think, you know, as I said, this isn't an exercise in trying to demoralise people, but it is an exercise in trying to get people to focus clearly on what the problems are, where they may arise, what the scale of the issues are that are in front of us. What could meet this? Well, first of all, the administration as a whole, and not Jeremy Corbyn on his own, have to be convinced and have to have people in place that are as convinced and as committed to that kind of radical transformation as he is. We've seen what division in the Parliamentary Labour Party looks like, and we've seen what damage it does in opposition. In government, you can magnify that by 100, because it won't just be a sympathetic press that's willing to magnify what the right wing got to say. So will the civil service, so will the Bank of England, so will the corporations, and on and on and on. So stabilising a leadership of government which has Corbyn's politics and not necessarily even what is currently Labour Party policy, that's important. But even more important than this, the government has to be able to be both accountable to and supported by a much wider mass movement. And this brings me back not to just what might happen in the future, but about what can happen now. Because you see, it matters how the Tories fall. It matters when they fall, and it matters how they fall. If they simply, and this is of course entirely likely, they simply implode under the weight of their own total incapacity to deal with the situation. And by the way, the roots, I just should mention this isn't just a kind of normal Tory sort of disaster of personal ambition, infighting, greed, avarice, whatever else. The kind of scale of the Tory party crisis now is produced by a very, very unusual circumstance, and that is that the leading party of British capital is out of sync with what the majority of British capital think about Europe. You know, there's absolutely no doubt the big enterprises in this country, the corporations, the Financial Times, the Economist, the Bank of England, the National Farmers Union, all want Remain. And the Tory party has managed catastrophically to get itself in a place where it is representing the minority view of the Little Englander, small business, you know, xenophobic, moronic section of the Tory party, in opposition to what big capital actually wants to happen. Now that is a crisis that you don't see every day, and possibly we haven't seen since the Corn Laws in the early part of the 19th century, where the Tory party simply becomes decoupled from its main class base. So that's a very big crisis, and therefore a very big opportunity for the whole of the Labour movement. But I mean, for this reason, of course, it's entirely possible that the government can simply implode under the weight of this contradiction. But it would be much, much better in general, and specifically for the fate of an incoming Labour government, if it fell because the strikes over pay, or the demonstrations against austerity, or over housing, or over what it seems to me is absolutely inevitably going to be the worst winter crisis in the NHS, bar none, this winter, if that kind of movement were wholly or partly responsible for driving the Tories from office and doing it as quickly as possible, then a Labour government will come in a totally different, both ideological circumstance. You know, a mobilised working population is obviously more politically sensitive, more radicalised, more capable of thinking of action that it can take to defend a Labour government than it would be otherwise. So I think the dangers are inside the Labour movement that exclusive or overemphasis on electoralism won't deliver the kind of defeat for the Tories which best enables a Labour government to carry out its programme. Now, I don't underestimate, of course, you've got to win an election. But you don't win elections simply by electioneering, not from our side of the fence either. And you certainly don't win the kind of election that's necessary to create a political climate in which Labour can successfully begin to implement a programme as radical as this one is. So I think there's a very serious debate to be had inside the Labour movement. And this is separate, you know, this isn't the same, it's different from the sort of revolution versus reform debate. In a way, it's a debate about how Jeremy Corbyn can get as far as it's conceivably possible that he will get or could get under the best possible circumstances. And I think that requires a kind of partial reorientation of the movement on the basis that extra parliamentary struggle is actually the thing that's going to provide the context in which a parliamentary left-led government has the best chance of success.
Thanks, John. So we've got plenty of time for comments and questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that Judy raised first there is actually very important about the whole sort of timing thing, because I think, you know, Lenin made this point that there are years when nothing happens and weeks where the events of years happen, and we're in one of those kind of speeded up historical moments, and the things that we thought yesterday are kind of out of date today, and that's the point. That's the point of this meeting. You know, I mean, I'm very glad the mood was as electric as it was at Labour Party conference. But in left-wing politics, hubris is usually followed by nemesis, because it's a congratulation about what's happened, what is happening, and not enough fear about what's going to happen next, not enough thought about what's going to happen next. And I think that's the importance of this debate, not in this room, but this debate happening right across the Labour movement. The only guarantee is that the movements are under their own leadership and their own democratic leadership, and not a sort of flywheel driven off any parliamentary party. It's also very important, I think, when so much is centred on the Labour Party, that we say that the mass movements are all party and no party organisations. You know, it's certainly true and good that the Labour Party is the biggest single political party in Europe, 500,000 members. British working class is about 40 million. So, you know, you have to think in what terms of millions of people are going to do and what they're thinking and how they're reacting, rather than just what even a very big party can do. And by the way, if you thought that sectarian behaviour is the sole province of small left-wing groups, it's not. Big and not so left-wing groups can behave like that as well towards mass movements. That's not a limited event on the far left. And I think we have to fight to get Labour people to do that. You know, not enough of the new Labour MPs are doing what Jeremy Corbyn was doing when he was a backbencher. That's simply a statement of fact. You know, we invited Afzal Khan at the major demonstration outside the Tory Party Conference. It's a fantastic demonstration, tens of thousands of people, very, very effective. Afzal Khan, the new Labour MP in Manchester, was on demonstration, and so were a whole bunch of, you know, I mean a whole bunch, 20, 30 Labour councillors to their credit. But we asked Rebecca Long-Bailey, who's a Manchester MP, no reply. We asked Angela Rayner, Manchester area MP, no reply. That's not good enough. It's really not good enough, and it's self-harming for all the reasons that I say. Richard's point, there's this moment there, and I suddenly envisaged a huge Ford-like factory producing didgeridoos running off the production line. So I'm glad we moved back from that. I think where we are is, you know, if you think about this historically, the Corbynism happened very suddenly because it was the product of 10 years worth of anti-globalisation, anti-capitalist, anti-war activity, which then suddenly found a sort of electric point of contact inside the Labour Party and transformed Labour Party politics. So there's a process here. You know, Corbynism and its antecedents are a process, and the process hasn't stopped. And I think that what is now happening is something which a lot of us thought actually would happen a lot earlier, that the kind of political radicalisation would begin to spill over into trade union and into strike action. I mean, I remember the first time I ever sort of thought through what the potential for this would be was on the stage in Hyde Park on February 15, 2003 at the huge anti-war demonstration, and Billy Hayes, who was then the General Secretary of the CWU, was on the stage, standing right at the front of the stage with his notebook, writing stuff in his notebook. So it looked odd, so I said, Billy, what are you doing? And he said, I'm looking out at the crowd, trying to spot CWU members, because the people from the CWU who are on this demonstration will be our next shop stewards. Now that was a brilliant thought, and that process has taken a long train coming. But I think it is, and perhaps it took transforming the Labour Party as an intermediary step before we got there. But I think we are getting there. I mean, after all, if 13 million people voted for the most left-wing leader that the Labour Party has ever had, and the most left-wing manifesto in a generation, and there are only 7 million people in trade unions, you can see where the problem and the potential is. But we've got to think of it like that. You know, if you're thinking too narrowly electorally, you're not thinking about that issue, and that's the life-saving issue to be thinking about, even before we get to the question of strike action. And I agree with the points that Richard and Kieran made about that. You know, we need to gear as much of the left up as we can into addressing that question. Union building, union action, strike action, as well as the protests and demonstrations that we already do, because this is you know, future bad things prevention activity. That's the way we have to look at that. I don't think that, you know, I mean, Cameron's point, if I sort of paraphrase it correctly, is can the ruling class kind of move sufficiently towards a Keynesian type model to kind of absorb the ground? No, but if the Labour leadership and the whole of the movement aren't tough enough, they can look like they are. You know, we've been here before. You know, it's not true that Blair didn't pump money into health and education. They did. That Labour government did do that. I mean, the whole thing's overshadowed by Iraq, of course, which is another lesson about why you can't ignore foreign policy. But nevertheless, they did. Actually, the last rounds of quantitative easing were money pumped into the economy. But it was, in the first case, in the Blair case, it was privatisers' Keynesianism, and in the second case, it was bankers' Keynesianism. The money went into those areas, and possibly, had they not been so absolutely intent on using it to make money out of property investment and keeping the money in the bank, might have led to actual investment, but it wouldn't have led to increased wages, increased trade union organisation, and a sharply rising living standard for workers, because that isn't the business they're in, and that's where the rub is. Yeah, well, I guess a lot of that discussion can be sort of summed up or addressed this way. Really, it's always the case. Sort of bedrock ideas about socialism or about any kind of working class organisation really boil down to this, that working people really only have two things. They don't have economic power, they don't have political power, they don't have military power, they have numbers and organisation. And even the numbers aren't any good without the organisation. And from numbers and organisation, properly deployed, you get confidence. And confidence is the most valuable thing in the working class movement. With an unconfident, atomised and divided working class, the Tories and the capitalist class can do anything they like. And that's what they did after the defeat of the miners and the associated trade union struggles. What they really fear now is not this or that policy or this or that particular kind of political development. They have a finely tuned sense that confidence is returning to working class people, and with it various forms of political organisation. And that's what we have to keep our eyes very firmly on, because that's the sort of thread that connects fighting for reform and change now with being able to challenge the system in the future. If there is a face-off between a left Corbyn government and the ruling class, then the question of power will arise in a different context. What will be built on the ground to defend that government? What will it look like? And in the process of defending that government, will it not take on characteristics where working people are beginning to shape the society around them for themselves? You see this all the time, actually. It sort of breaks surface every now and again. I mean, the British working class's attachment to the NHS is at root about the idea that something as important as healthcare is taken out of the control of capitalism and the private market, and that it's run for people's benefit by very hard-working working people in the health service itself. I think it was Nigel Lawson said, the British people only have one religion, and it's the NHS. And the trouble is, the Tories are looked on as non-believers, which of course they are. But you can also see, in the response to Grenfell, what really happened there is that a very diverse, mixed working class community proved themselves better capable of taking care of themselves than either local or national government. Now that's a dangerous moment. When ordinary working people look more politically aware, better organised, and more moral than the government, that's a government that's got a real problem. And it's a system that's got a real problem. And if that begins to happen not just in this or that locality or around this or that institution, but across the face of the society, then you're beginning to see a real sea change in political possibilities. But it stems out of being able to do the achievable things now. I'm all in favour of education, and I'm all in favour of people thinking about the structure of society and all the rest of it. But you've got to be able to be part of delivering change now. Tony Benn, many times when I spoke to him, used to tell this story about when he was an MP in Bristol, that he got a letter from a constituent which said, "Dear Mr. Benn, I see the Russians have managed to put a vehicle on the moon. What chance do you think there is of a decent bus service in Bristol?" Now, the bus service question is always absolutely critical. You can only really get a hearing from working people if you show you any use now about changing their wages and conditions, about doing something about housing, about saving the National Health Service. After that, and if you're engaged in that alongside them, then all sorts of other intellectual possibilities and practical political possibilities open up, and that's where we are. I think that's we've no interest in separating ourselves from that mood, and indeed building that to get as far as that conceivably can, as well as it conceivably can. Because if we arrive at that point in the best possible order, in the most conscious political form, then other possibilities of defence and going beyond defence will open up for us. The danger is that triangulation reappears in a left form. Everybody's got rid of it now because, as Jeremy in his speech to the European Socialist parties today said, everybody was triangulating on the basis that the common sense of the society was in one place, whereas actually it was never there. It was somewhere else. But there is a kind of left triangulation that creeps back in, that we can't go that far, or we can't do that much, or we can't do this. Whereas actually, as Lenin again said, there's nothing so radical as reality. And believe me, working people in this country have had it for decade after decade with this, and the expressions currently of that in both trade union struggle and in Labour Party policy are nowhere near as radical as the mood and anger among working people now. I mean, just think about that dementia tax thing, which was so important. This is happened to my mum. These are people who've saved all their lives to buy some miserable house, and at the end of their life, the government is going to take that off them, give it to a private healthcare company to put them in a home where the staff, but according to the Commons report, 40% of them can't medicate patients, and 50% of them leave within a year. So that's just one aspect of it. You can do that right across the healthcare system, right across the education system, right across the housing system, right across bullying at work. Now, believe me, we haven't even begun to tap that as a kind of motor of change. And I think that's what's, that's what we've got to try and do. And if you express that, of course, then it seems to me inconceivable that the state won't behave in a way that it did during the miners' strike, or the way that it tried it until the anti-war movement became so big that it couldn't really get on top of it without making the situation worse. I just think that's where we are.
To sum up?
Yeah. So. Well, just as first of all about the sort of point of meetings like this, of course, a sort of strategic discussion, which is what we're at least attempting to have tonight. That will be something which I guess attracts disproportionately people who are already politically engaged and thinking about these questions. But what it should also do, I think, if it's worked properly, is to give people some ideas and facts and arguments that then, when they're talking to their workmates or fellow trade union members or members of their family or whoever, people in their community, makes them more effective at carrying an argument. I think that's the point of it. So I wouldn't expect necessarily the same atmosphere in a meeting like this as I would if I was speaking in a trade union branch or just to, friends who live in the block flats that I live in, or whatever. But I would hope that these discussions inform and assist you when you're having those discussions. That's kind of the point of them. It's often, we often get the criticism. It hasn't happened in this meeting, but it's happened to me enough where somebody gets up in you and says, "Well, you're just preaching to the converted." And my answer to that is that the church has worked for thousands of years very effectively by preaching to the converted, because they've spotted that what happens is that the converted then go out and preach to the unconverted, and that's how it works. And it's the same. It's got concentric circles of influence, if you like, in the movement. So that's kind of how I see the role of these meetings. They're not the only meetings we do. When I was up in Manchester, I don't know what we had in Castlefields Arena, probably 10,000-20,000 people. And in a 3-minute speech, we'd make some of the same points, but obviously in very different kind of language. And I know Chris was down speaking at the festival to whatever that audience is. But he seemed to be doing all right. So that's the sort of relationship between a strategic discussion and when you put things in a much simpler, more general way out there. I don't think we've got a massive. I mean, it's a strange. If you've been on the left for a while, it's quite a strange thing to say. I don't actually think there's a lot of opposition among millions of working class people to what we say. And if you look at the opinion polls, the British Social Attitude Survey, which is the government's own survey of public opinion, it's like a book, you get it from the stationery office and so forth. You go through that, 85% of people think that the railway should be renationalised. Something like in excess of 60% of people think that privatisation has gone too far. On and on and on. There've always been opinion poll majorities against the foreign wars. There's it's not everything. Immigration, we're in a minority definitely on that question. That's a harder argument. But on very, very substantial social questions, we've got a sort of passive support. The question is to turn it into active support. That's really where the problem lies. It's not that there aren't enough people that agree with us. There are millions of people that agree with us. It's making those people effective by political organisation. That's the trick that we've really got to focus of whatever kind, of trade union kind, of the political party kind, of the mass movements like Stop the War and the People's Assembly, whatever. I don't really care actually, as long as somebody who's passive and agrees with you begins to become active and agrees with you. That's what's going to change politics. It's always what changes politics. With the Labour Party, we have the counterpart people and the revolutionary left in general have a kind of end of the day question here, which Dan raised and whatnot. Do you think that you can transform a capitalist society into a socialist society predominantly by means of parliamentary legislation? I don't. And I think that a mass movement of working class people which take control of society into their own hands by direct means from below, that's necessary to make that change. And I don't want to not say that, and I don't think I'd be let into the Labour Party anyway, but I certainly don't want to be let into the Labour Party on the basis that I can't say things I believe. So that kind of entryism, as it's sometimes called, doesn't interest me. I think it's dishonest politics. I'm not interested. And what's critical here is it's never stopped me working with Labour Party people. You know, I grew up in the Labour Party family. My dad was in the Labour Party. He came from South Wales. You know, the first thing I learned is that if you put up a donkey with a Labour rosette on it, it'd get voted in South Wales. You know, so I've never felt outside that Labour movement in that sense. I've never felt unable to work with and organise alongside. I spent a long time doing it with Jeremy Corbyn. So I don't feel that there's a barrier to that dialogue. If other people do, that's kind of their problem as far as I'm concerned. And in any case, it's kind of a requirement in the Labour movement. In a trade union, you work with people with all sorts of different political views. In a mass movement like Stop the War, we don't just work with Labour Party people, we work with the Greens and people who are in no party at all, and Quakers and Muslims, and on and on and on. And if anything is going to get done, that kind of political cooperation has to be there, and that's the basis for an open and comradely discussion, in my view, which may be rarer than it should be on the left, but I don't think it's impossible. You know, my teacher told me it's about, the person I learnt most of my politics from said, this is how a picket line works. On a picket line, if somebody who's on strike with you makes a racist remark, you can do a number of things. You can do the unprincipled thing, which is pretend it hasn't happened, or you can do the principled thing, which is to argue with them about the racist remark they've made. But the one thing that you don't do is when the scab truck comes down the road, you don't say, you're a racist, I'm not linking arms with you. You link arms with them, stop the scabs, and then continue to have the argument. And that's my model for how the Labour movement works. I have very serious disagreements with some people, which I want to discuss in a comradely way, but it will never stop me uniting with them against the main enemy. And that's how I think we've got to approach the whole question of working class organisation and the question of what a Corbyn government will look like. You know, I want a Corbyn government to get as far and be as successful as it possibly can, because if they're right, then we've won. If I'm right, it's the best preparation for the next stage of the struggle. And on that basis, it seems to me there's a lot of ground for cooperation and comradely discussion of the type that we've had tonight. Just finally, let's face it, we're not short of things to do here. You know, there's a lot. You know, the NHS campaigns I know are holding a conference soon. They've approached the People's Assembly about whether or not we should have a national demonstration next March over the NHS. I don't know what, we haven't discussed that yet. I don't know what we'll decide about it, but it's certainly one very real possibility. Chris has mentioned the budget day stuff. We haven't discussed in any detail foreign affairs stuff, but you know, Donald Trump is president of the United States. I just can't see it going away as an issue. So I don't think we'll and people discuss the unions and the strike action. We're not short of stuff to do here, and it's important stuff. And whether we win or lose on these fights will shape the future. So all that's good. I just want to make sure that inside that we have a very clear-sighted, serious appraisal of the forces ranged against us and what we should do about it. This isn't some marginal discussion happening amongst a group of people in some place in society where it doesn't really matter what we decide or what the outcome of it is. Everybody knows this is about whether or not there's going to be a left-Labour government, whether or not that government will succeed, whether or not 30, 40 years of neoliberalism at home and neoconservative foreign policy abroad is going to get broken or not. These are, they are historic times, and the worst thing that the left can do is just surf on its own good mood and not address seriously what the problems are and what the solutions might be.